Story number 1.
The Doll in the Attic. When Emma's grandmother passed away, the family inherited her sprawling old Victorian house. It was filled with antiques, creaking floors, and an attic no one had ventured into for years. Emma volunteered to sort through the attic, eager to uncover forgotten treasures. She spent hours wading through dust-covered trunks, faded photographs, and tarnished silver. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, she discovered something unusual. It was a doll, propped up in the corner of the attic. The doll was old and hand-sewn, with porcelain skin, glass eyes that seemed too lifelike, and a faded lace dress. But what struck Emma most was its expression. It wasn't smiling like most dolls. Its mouth was turned down slightly, as if it were frowning. Emma brought the doll downstairs to show her family. "Oh, that thing," her mother said, visibly uneasy. "Your grandmother hated it. She always kept it locked up in the attic." "Why?" Emma asked. "She said it gave her nightmares," her mother replied. "I don't know why she didn't just get rid of it." Emma shrugged. "It's just a doll. I think it's kind of cool." Ignoring her mother's protests, Emma decided to keep the doll and placed it on a shelf in her room. That night the nightmares began. In her dream, Emma was in the attic again, but it was darker, and the air was thick with the scent of mildew. The doll was standing in the center of the room, much larger than it should have been. Its head slowly turned toward her, and its glass eyes seemed to glow. "You shouldn't have taken me," it said in a hollow, childlike voice. Emma woke up drenched in sweat, her heart racing. She glanced at the shelf where the doll sat, and for a split second she could have sworn its head was tilted slightly to the side, as if it had been watching her. The following nights grew worse. Emma would hear faint giggling in the darkness, though her room was empty. Sometimes she'd wake up to find the doll in a different position, its head turned, its arms slightly raised, as if reaching for something. One morning she found scratch marks on her bedroom floor, leading from the shelf to her bed. Her mother grew concerned and insisted they get rid of the doll. But when Emma tried to throw it away, she found it back on her shelf the next morning, its expression somehow even more menacing. Desperate, Emma researched the doll's origins. She found an old photo of her grandmother as a child, holding the very same doll. In the margins of the photo, someone had written, "Evelyn's friend." Digging deeper, Emma learned that Evelyn, her grandmother's younger sister, had drowned in the backyard pond when they were children. Rumors in the family suggested that Evelyn had always spoken to the doll as if it were alive and insisted it told her secrets. Emma decided to confront the doll. Late at night, she sat in her room, the doll on the bed before her. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. The room grew colder and the faint giggling returned, this time louder and more distinct. "You took me," a child's voice whispered, though Emma was alone. The doll's glass eyes seemed to follow her as she stood to leave. Suddenly the door slammed shut and the lights flickered. The giggling turned to a piercing scream. Panicking, Emma grabbed the doll and ran outside. She threw it into the fire pit in the backyard, dousing it with lighter fluid and setting it ablaze. The flames roared to life, and for a moment Emma thought she heard a faint wail coming from the burning doll. When the fire finally died down, only ashes remained. Relieved, Emma returned to the house, but as she climbed into bed, she froze. Sitting on the shelf was the doll, its dress unmarred, its glass eyes gleaming. Its frown had twisted into a smile.
Story number 2.
The Vanishing Road. Lucas was driving home late one night, taking a shortcut through the dense woods of Ashburn Forest. The road was narrow, with no streetlights, and the only sounds were the hum of his car engine and the occasional rustling of trees in the wind. He'd driven this route dozens of times before, but tonight felt different. The forest seemed darker, the shadows deeper, and the road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly. Lucas glanced at his phone for the time. Midnight. He was sure he should have reached the highway by now. The headlights illuminated a small wooden sign on the side of the road. "Turn back." Lucas frowned. He didn't remember ever seeing that sign before. He slowed the car, peering into the rearview mirror. The road behind him seemed to vanish into the blackness, as if it had been swallowed whole. Shaking his head, He kept driving, convincing himself it was just his tired mind playing tricks on him. But a few minutes later, the same sign appeared again, illuminated by his headlights. "Turn back." The air inside the car grew colder, and Lucas noticed the hairs on his arms standing on end. "Okay, this is weird," he muttered, gripping the steering wheel tighter. He tried checking his GPS, but the screen flickered and then froze. The signal was gone. Suddenly, he saw movement in the trees, a figure, barely visible, standing just off the side of the road. Lucas slammed on the brakes, his heart pounding. When he looked again, the figure was gone. He rolled down the window slightly, calling out, "Hello? Is someone there?" Only silence answered him. Deciding it was best to keep moving, Lucas pressed on, his eyes darting between the road and the trees. That's when he saw it. A car, overturned in a ditch, its headlights dimly flickering. Lucas pulled over and grabbed his phone, hoping to call for help, but there was still no signal. He approached the wreck cautiously, shining a flashlight into the car. The seats were empty, but there was blood smeared across the dashboard and driver's seat. As he turned to head back to his car, he heard a faint voice. "Help me!" The voice was coming from deeper in the woods. Against his better judgment, Lucas followed it, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The voice grew louder, more desperate. "Help me, please!" Finally, he reached a clearing. In the middle stood a woman, her back to him. She wore a tattered white dress, her long hair matted and tangled. "Are you okay?" Lucas asked, stepping closer. The woman didn't respond. He reached out, his hand trembling, but as he touched her shoulder, she turned around. Her face was wrong. Distorted, hollow eyes that seemed to pull him into endless voids, and a mouth twisted into an unnatural, toothy grin. Lucas stumbled back, dropping his flashlight. The beam spun wildly, casting eerie shadows. The woman let out a low, guttural laugh, her body twitching and contorting unnaturally. Terrified, Lucas bolted back to his car. He fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking, and finally managed to start the engine. As he sped down the road, the woman appeared in his rearview mirror, standing in the middle of the road, her grin growing wider. But the road ahead didn't lead to the highway. It looped back to where he'd started, the same wooden sign greeting him once again. "Turn back." Panic set in, as Lucas realized he was trapped. No matter how far or fast he drove, the road always brought him back to the same spot. The trees seemed to close in, and the shadows grew darker, more oppressive. Then the whispers began. They came from everywhere, overlapping voices that hissed his name, urging him to stop the car and step outside. In the distance, he saw headlights, another car approaching. Relief washed over him as he honked and flashed his lights to get their attention. But as the car passed, Lucas's blood ran cold. It was his car, the exact same make, model, and license plate, with himself behind the wheel. Lucas slammed on the brakes, breathing heavily. The whispers grew louder, and the trees seemed to move closer, their branches stretching toward him like claws. And then he saw her, the woman in white, standing in the middle of the road ahead, her hollow eyes locked onto him. This time, she raised her hand, pointing directly at him. The engine died and the lights flickered out, plunging Lucas into darkness. The last thing he heard was her voice echoing in his ears. "You should have turned back." The next morning, Lucas's car was found abandoned on the side of the road, the driver's seat covered in blood. No one ever found him.
Story number 3.
The room that changed. Mira and Ethan were newlyweds, excited to move into their first home together. It was a modest, 2-story house in a quiet neighborhood, perfect for starting their life as a couple. The previous owners had mentioned one peculiar detail. The small room at the end of the upstairs hall always seemed off. They'd brushed it off as superstition, but Mira couldn't shake the uneasy feeling she got when she first stepped into it. The room was empty except for peeling wallpaper, a dusty wooden floor, and a single small window. "We can turn it into a guest room," Ethan said cheerfully, but Mira wasn't so sure. Strange things started happening almost immediately. One morning, Mira noticed the door to the small room was slightly ajar, even though she was certain they had left it closed. "Did you leave this open?" she asked Ethan. He shook his head. Maybe it didn't latch properly. But it wasn't just the door. At night, they'd hear faint creaking noises like footsteps coming from the room. Ethan insisted it was the house settling, but Mira began avoiding the room altogether. A week later, Ethan decided to start renovating the room. "I'm going to strip the wallpaper and give it a fresh coat of paint," he announced. Mira didn't argue, hoping a change might make the room feel less unsettling. But as Ethan peeled back the wallpaper, he froze. "Mira," he called, his voice unsteady. She hurried upstairs to find him staring at the wall, where the wallpaper had been removed. Carved into the plaster, in uneven, jagged letters, was a phrase, "It hurts here." They decided to leave the room alone for the night, shaken by what they'd found. That evening, Mira dreamed of the room. In her dream, it was filled with old, broken furniture and a young girl sitting in the corner, sobbing into her hands. "Who are you?" Mira asked. The girl didn't answer. Instead, she raised her head, revealing a pale face with hollow black eyes. Mira woke with a start, her heart pounding. She glanced at Ethan, still asleep beside her, and then at the hallway. The door to the small room was wide open. The next day, Ethan suggested they seal the room off entirely. "I don't care if we lose the space. It's not worth the weirdness," he said. They started moving tools out of the room, but when Ethan picked up the paint can, he stopped cold. "Mira," he whispered, pointing to the floor. There, on the dusty wooden planks, were fresh footprints, small, bare, and impossibly clear. That night, the house felt heavier, as if the air itself was pressing down on them. Around 3 a.m., Mira woke to the sound of muffled sobbing. She nudged Ethan awake. "Do you hear that?" They followed the sound to the hallway. It was coming from the small room. Ethan, armed with a flashlight, opened the door cautiously. The room was empty, but the sobbing continued, echoing faintly. Then, the flashlight flickered and went out. "Mira, let's get out of here," Ethan said, his voice shaking. But before they could leave, the door slammed shut behind them. The temperature in the room plummeted, and a low, guttural moan filled the air. On the walls, words began to appear, as if carved by invisible hands. "Why did you come? Leave me alone." Mira and Ethan pounded on the door, screaming for help, but the room seemed to absorb the sound. Then the sobbing stopped, replaced by a chilling silence. In the corner of the room, the shadow of a figure began to form. The figure was small, childlike, but its presence was anything but innocent. Its head tilted unnaturally, and it moved closer, its feet never touching the ground. Mira clung to Ethan, her breath coming in short gasps. "What do you want?" she whispered. The figure paused, then raised a hand to point at the wall. Carved into the plaster, a new message appeared. "This is my room." The door burst open, and the couple stumbled out, gasping for air. They didn't stay the night. By morning, they'd packed their belongings and left the house for good. A few weeks later, they learned the house's history. Decades earlier, a young girl had been locked in that very room by her abusive parents. She'd died there, alone and forgotten. The new owners of the house never reported any issues with the small room. But Mira and Ethan knew better. The room had chosen to stay quiet, at least for now.